welcome to everyone who has joined us this morning. The last in the current series. Can't believe we've come to the end of our spring term. Thank you to everyone who has been with us on our journey this term. And we have now got to the learner's choice. And as I mentioned previously, Malcolm and I collected all the suggestions, all the emails that came in, everything that went into the chat box during the previous talks, and the top topic that came out from all the suggestions was the Anglo-Saxons. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to, as always, use some objects from the wonderful British Museum, and we're going to have a look at the Anglo-Saxons right from the start of what historians know as the Anglo-Saxon period in English history through to 1066. And as we go on this journey, we're going to see that the Anglo-Saxon period is a wonderful period of sort of opposites, invaders who themselves become invaded, a journey from a pagan to a Christian religious viewpoint, and also non-literate to literate. So lots of developments that roll out over what is actually hundreds of years of history, one of the longer periods of history that we talk about when we talk about, say, the Tudors. We're looking at a period of history where we've got about 100 years, but we're looking at the Anglo-Saxons. We're going all the way from the end of Roman Britain, so around 411 AD, all the way through till 1066. And what we're also going to do is we're going to look at where we have influences coming in from existing lifestyles in Britain, and also influences that the Anglo-Saxons bring with them, and that actually on occasion come to bear on the Anglo-Saxons themselves. So without further ado, I'm going to pick up my slideshow. We're going to start from the beginning, and we are going to take an opportunity this morning to find out about the Anglo-Saxons at the British Museum. Now, I want to begin by saying that when we use the term Anglo-Saxons nowadays, we're actually referring to several groups of people, including the Saxons, the Jutes, and the Angles from Northern Europe. And the Anglo-Saxon period itself is one of fascinating contrast, the non-literate to literate, the pagan to Christian, the invaders to invaded. And it's a period that draws on the culture of many different peoples. So we're going to find out about traditions and cultures of the Germanic people, together with those of Scandinavia. And we're going to begin by having a look at the legacy of Roman occupation of Britain. And we begin here with a section of wall from late Roman Britain, known as the Meonstoke Barn. It's part of a building. It's on display at the British Museum in room 49. It's 2 meters tall and about 1.90 meters across. And it was constructed in Hampshire in the early AD 300s. And it collapsed sometime after AD 353. And we know this because that is the latest date on a coin that was found underneath the wall. So if the date on the coin is AD 353 and it is underneath the wall, then the wall fell on top of that coin after AD 353. And when the wall was constructed, Britain was part of the Roman Empire, and the Roman province of Britannia stopped functioning as a meaningful political, economic, and military entity around AD 411. Before this, Saxons from mainland Europe, specifically the region near the North Sea coast of modern northern Germany, served in the Roman army. And the movement of people for military, economic, and settlement reasons was active throughout the period of Roman history in Britain. And the objects we're going to look at today all carry information about Anglo-Saxon culture, and provide a number of starting points for considering life in Britain at this time. Now, this section of wall that we're looking at came from a villa estate near Meonstoke in Hampshire. It was excavated by King Alfred's College, Winchester, and lifted by the British Museum in 1989. And archaeologists were able to reconstruct the whole building by studying the remains and where they lay. And this wall, built using flints, terracotta tiles, mortar, and also greenstone, which you can see has been used here as a more decorative stone for the base and the top of the pretend columns set into the wall, give an indication that this was probably part of a large aisled barn sitting on a wealthy agricultural villa estate in late Roman Britain. What's of interest to us are these holes that you can see driven through the facade. And these holes were cut when the wall was lying on the ground. And archaeologists believe that they mark the foundations of a wooden structure of the early Anglo-Saxon period, erected in around 400s or 500s AD. So what they show us is on a larger scale. If we look at the bigger picture, we can see that an area of rich agricultural land is continuing in use between Roman Britain and the early Anglo-Saxon period. We have people continuing to live in this area, continuing to work the land. What we have at the same time is a change in the structures that they are using as part of their farming settlement. And I like to think that when they started to construct these wooden structures, this wall, which had fallen on the ground, even if it had by that point become covered with a thin layer of soil or perhaps some vegetative debris, would have acted as a solid foundation. You've almost got a ready-made floor for your later structure. And as this structure was erected, the wooden poles holding up the walls and the roof of that Anglo-Saxon structure were then driven down through this hard floor. So these sections of the wall have been lost forever, dug out hundreds of years ago. And then the wooden building itself was erected across this area of the wall, which would have acted as the floor for the building, which in all probability extended beyond the size of this wall, which when it was on the ground would have only been about 2 meters square, not really large enough for a large agricultural building, but formed part of the foundation and perhaps an area of hard flooring within that building. What we're looking at here is an early Anglo-Saxon pot. We're looking at a handmade grey-brown pottery buckle urn, and it's decorated with incised. We can see where the lines have been drawn through the clay before it was fired, and stamped decoration. We can see the small points where probably a sharpened stick has been driven into the clay before firing. And also it has been pinched to create these small bosses running around the outside of the urn, probably either by pinching the surface or by pressing from inside the pot before firing. Now, for the Anglo-Saxons, pottery was a very important method of producing cooking pots, bowls, cups, lamps, bottles, and jugs. And in early Anglo-Saxon times, pottery urns, such as the one we're looking at here on screen, were used to hold cremated ashes. And many of these cremation urns were highly decorated. The vast majority of early Anglo-Saxon pottery was probably made within a village or on a farm, using methods such as coiling or thumb pots. Later on, there were specialist potters who made wheel-thrown pottery in the developing Anglo-Saxon towns. These were sold by the potter, possibly by travelling merchants in the market, or by the potter themselves directly from their workshop. Although throughout the Anglo-Saxon period, a lot of pottery would still have been home produced. And we're going to see a couple of pots probably which were home produced, circulated in a small locality. We're looking at here at a small pot to the left from the Anglo-Saxon site at Mucking in Essex. And this dates to the 400s to mid 600s. So again, the early Anglo-Saxon period. And then on the other side, we have a slightly later pot. This is a cooking pot dating to around 850. Now, our small pot on the left is a small round bellied bowl. It's got a flared rim and a rounded base, and it's decorated again with incised and stamped decorations. We can see a number of horizontal and vertical lines, inside which there are stamped decorations of circles. And then if we look lower down on the pot, we can see that also stamping to make crescent shapes. And the clay to form this pot has been mixed with local sand to strengthen it. And archaeologists refer to this as tempering the clay. The pot is quite small. It has a diameter of about 9 centimetres. It's only 6 centimetres tall and has been found almost complete. It's unusual for a lot of early Anglo-Saxon pottery to be found in such a complete state. It's quite delicate. It's what archaeologists call quite friable, easily broken. And this one we can see before excavation had indeed sustained damage around the rim, which may have been the reason why it was discarded, or indeed this damage might have occurred after it had been in the ground, pressure from the soil or from other objects buried near it. The pot on the other side is a cooking pot, and this is made from a red clay mixed with crushed shell, and you can just see a few of these pieces of crushed shell standing out as white inclusions on the body of this cooking pot. This is larger, has a diameter of 15 centimetres and a height of 10 centimetres, and it is known by archaeologists as shelly ware. It's a type of pottery found in Britain from the 600s all the way through to the 1100s. And in this case, the clay that is used to make the pottery is tempered with crushed shells. And shelly ware was made and distributed predominantly in the Upper Thames Valley, the South East and the East Midlands. And both of the pots we're looking at here were handmade. Evidence would suggest that it was only after about AD 900 that the potter's wheel came back into use. And the type of potter's wheel being used in the later Anglo-Saxon period probably varied from a small hand-turned turntable, known as a slow wheel, to the larger kick wheels that we're more au fait with nowadays. And by the time we get to late Anglo-Saxon period, there were several major pottery centres in England. So we have a concentration of pottery production, and these centres are then exporting their wares throughout the country. And these centres include Thetford, Stamford, Lincoln, St Neots, Winchester and Ipswich. So across late Anglo-Saxon period, we have a combination of centrally made pottery made at these centres, which then is sold and traded across Britain, in combination with more local pottery, probably still made on the farm or in a small town or village, which then circulates within a much smaller region and probably is of a less substantial, more friable nature. Now, the other material that we find from the Anglo-Saxon period, right from the beginning of the Anglo-Saxon period, is glass. And we're looking at here a set of glass beakers dating to the early 600s. And these reconstructed glass beakers are made from an olive green glass. And they're decorated with spiral trails, which you can see going round the top of the glasses, and then also you can see the spiral trails going around the bottom, and with 8 claws around the bottom half of each beaker. And this claw shape developed from a Roman style of decoration with applied dolphins. And then over time into the early Anglo-Saxon period, these evolved into what archaeologists call these claws, hence the name for this type of beaker, which is a claw beaker. They were found in Buckinghamshire at Taplow, and each of them is about 28 centimetres tall, but thin, narrow, like a modern champagne flute. They only have a diameter of about 10 centimetres each. Now, the majority of glass vessels from the early Anglo-Saxon period come from cemetery sites. Excavations of settlement sites have revealed fragments of similar vessel types, indicating that this was the common type of glass that circulated in both domestic and also was used for ritual deposit in graves. However, there is a significant difference between late Roman and early Anglo-Saxon glass vessels, because as we go into the Anglo-Saxon period, glass working techniques became more limited. Few of the Anglo-Saxon forms can be classified as tableware, as this term implies that the vessels can be set on a flat surface, i.e. a table. Instead, Anglo-Saxon forms usually have rounded or pointed bases, or where bases are present, as we can see here on our Taplow beakers, the beaker itself would have been too top heavy and unstable to have really stood with any certainty on the small foot. And this implies that these vessels would have been held in the hand until the drink was completed, either by an individual or within a group who were passing the vessels around between them. And vessels such as the ones on screen have also been found in northern France, Germany, the Netherlands, and Belgium. And the main centre of production was probably in modern day Germany. And we know that glass at this time could be tinted green, as the ones on screen, or possibly brown, blue, or yellow. Now, many examples of Anglo-Saxon glass seem to have been made in Britain. There doesn't seem to be a high level of importation from those German centres of production. And at this point, we need to make a clear distinction between glass making and glass working. So glass making is the production of raw glass from raw materials. On the other hand, glass working refers to the processing of this raw glass into a final vessel, or recycling glass to create new glass objects. And there's very little evidence of glass making from raw materials in Roman Britain, and even less Anglo-Saxon Britain. Instead, glass was made from raw materials which are found further east in the Roman Empire, And then lumps of raw glass were transported across the empire for working into a final vessel elsewhere. Another source of glass was recycled, broken or crushed glass. And this recycling occurred throughout the Roman period. And there are large deposits of broken glass at Winchester and Hamwick, suggesting that this glass was also being recycled through into the Anglo-Saxon period. And by recycling glass, it was possible to keep up with the demand for glass products without new raw glass having to be introduced into the system. Because as the economic infrastructure of late Roman Britain starts to collapse and no longer functions, then the trade routes that were bringing raw glass from further east, areas such as Roman Syria and Egypt, are no longer as easily accessible. Therefore, you get continued glass production, but what you are looking at is the recycling of an existing closed set of objects, which are then reworked into the latest form and the latest fashion. The objects we've just seen came from the Taplow burial, and this burial was a mound burial at Taplow Court, Buckinghamshire, which archaeologists believe was constructed in the 600s. And the burial was made in what is referred to as the conversion period, when the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were undergoing Christianization. And this period saw a number of elite burials featuring lavish grave goods, far richer than the graves that have been excavated dating to the preceding 400s and 500s. And the majority of these later graves were away from early churchyard burials, and the Taplow burial itself was on top of a hill inside an old Iron Age fort, which had widespread views of the local landscape. And buried beneath the Taplow mound was a single person, probably a member of the local elite, who was buried along objects including military gear, a sword, 3 spears and 2 shields, as well as drinking horns and the glass beakers we've just seen. Several of these items were probably made in Kent, suggesting that the person buried may have had links with the Kingdom of Kent. Little of the body survived, preventing any form of analysis to confidently determine either their age or their sex. The mound itself was excavated over 3 weeks in October 1883 by 3 local antiquarians. And we have here on the left of the screen a photograph of the mound being excavated. And at the time, it represented the most lavish known Anglo-Saxon burial, and remained so until discovery of the ship burial at Sutton Hoo, Suffolk in the 1930s. Now, within the mound, there was an oak-lined burial chamber, and we have a reconstruction of this to the right of the screen. It measured 3.6 meters by 2.4 meters and was set 2 meters below the base of the mound. So if we go back to the photograph, you can see here they're excavating down through the center of the mound, and the burial chamber itself would have been dug as the first part of construction directly into the ground surface. The body, the grave goods would have been deposited, and then the mound of earth would have been raised above the sunken burial chamber. Now, the archaeologist Martin Carver has argued that burial mounds such as this, erected in the late 500s and into the 600s, were created by followers of Anglo-Saxon paganism, who were defiantly displaying their beliefs and their identity in the face of encroaching Christianity. On the other hand, the historian John Blair disagrees, suggesting that they represent a monumental expression of elite status, so are more an expression of social hierarchy than of any change within religious practice. And it's interesting that this particular burial was found near the Kingdom of Kent, may have links with the Kingdom of Kent, which was one of the earliest kingdoms to adopt the Christian faith and to work with Christian missionaries arriving in Britain. We have to remember, however, that the Christian missionaries arriving in Britain are working with the pagan Anglo-Saxon elite. Christianity had existed in Britain from the Roman period, and we know from the writings of historians such as the Venerable Bede that Christian communities continued from the late Roman period into the Anglo-Saxon period, particularly in Western England. Now, at the request of the clergyman in charge of the churchyard where the burial mound was found, the objects from the mound were donated to the British Museum, and nowadays can be found on display opposite the objects recovered from the Sutton Hoo burial in the 1930s. We're now going to have a little think about language in the Anglo-Saxon period, and particularly written language. We're looking here at a small finger ring made from gold, and it is inscribed with a runic inscription. Now, the runic alphabet seems to have developed out of the Roman alphabet around the 300s in Scandinavia. It was composed of 24 characters, probably originally devised for ease of carving on wood or stone. Hence, when you look at a runic inscription, you're often struck by the number of straight lines, and even where you have what to our eye would be a rounded R shape, they are formed from two straight lines rather than one curved line. This is an easier way to incise the runes into a wood or stone surface. Now, the form of the characters varied across time and also in different places. So, for example, the Vikings used different runes to the early Anglo-Saxons. And runes themselves were not used for composing sentences until the 600s. Before that, they were mainly used for magical, talismanic, or ownership inscriptions. The runic alphabet itself was largely supplanted by the Latin alphabet of the Roman Church, but did continue to be employed, as we can see on this ring, for inscriptions. Now, this ring is actually quite late in the Anglo-Saxon period, probably dates to the 800s or the 900s AD, and it's known as the Gold Kingmore ring. It was discovered in June 1817 at Greymore Hill, Kingmore, near Carlisle. And by 1859, the ring was in the possession of the British Museum, who had received it as a gift from the Earl of Aberdeen. And there's a replica of the ring on display at Tully House Museum and Art Gallery in Carlisle. Now, we can see here in the middle of the screen the inscription which runs around the ring itself. And the last three characters, the toll sound, is written on the inside of the ring. The inscription has got 30 signs altogether and appears to be a magical runic formula. And there's some evidence that in addition to being a writing system, runes, by their very presence, served magical purposes. And this can be seen with the earliest evidence of runes from the late Roman into the early Germanic period, where there were non-linguistic inscriptions. So these inscriptions were never meant to be read aloud, but by their representation, by their appearance, they act as a magical talisman. And in addition, in medieval sources, there are mention of what are known as victory runes, which would be carved onto a sword. So here, by carving the runes onto the hilt or the blade of your sword, you would in fact be adding military value to your sword, because the victory runes would themselves then give victory to your sword. There are 7 known rings from the Anglo-Saxon period which bear these runic inscriptions, and the runes themselves represent the sounds of Old English. The next object is a stone cross fragment known as the Lancaster Cross, and this dates to the late AD 700s. And again, it's got a runic inscription in the centre panel, which is runic inscription of the Old English spoken language, and it translates as "Pray for Sithbolt Cuthbert," and it was discovered in St Mary's Churchyard, Lancashire in 1807. It's made from pale red sandstone. It's the upper part of a cross shaft, although you can see it arrived at the museum with the bottom half of the shaft missing and one of the horizontal arms broken off. The cross itself has interlaced decoration ending with an animal head, and you can just see one of the animal heads here on the right hand side on the surviving arm. There are bosses with drill holes in the centre, which may originally have contained gemstones or other fittings. And for the animal head, one might imagine that this boss represents the eye, and it may well have had a fitting representing the centre of the animal's eye. And then beneath it, we have the short runic inscription. And below the inscription is a panel with 2 linked Staffordshire knots. Now, what's interesting about this is that it's a very accomplished piece of work, but it was only ever intended to be seen from one side. The narrow sides have no decoration on them at all, while the back is hollowed out. And it isn't clear exactly what location this cross would have stood in. It may well have been installed within a pre-existing building, where it may have stood against an existing wall. And given its commemorative text and its cry for, or its plea for people viewing it to pray for, it may well have been set up as a memorial intended to mark an entrance to a church or a chapel, rather than as a grave marker or as a point of collection for an early Christian community, as we see with some other Anglo-Saxon crosses, which were discovered standing in existing churchyards outside the later church building. We have another piece of mid-Anglo-Saxon Christian ware, this time a small plaque, which we see on the left-hand side of the screen, which dates to the AD 700s. It's rectangular plaque made from a sheet of silver, incised on both sides with a halo figure inside a frame marked with diagonal lines. The piece of silver is 9 centimetres tall, 7 centimetres across. The figure has a halo around the head, suggesting a saint or perhaps Christ, and wears draped garments. And the cross-decorated panel running down the front of the body has been interpreted as either a book or a reliquary. And it was found in Hexham, Northumberland. And the simple linear style reflects that used on other pieces from this time. So, for example, we have here at the bottom on the right a fragment from St Cuthbert's coffin, a fragmentary oak coffin from Durham Cathedral, which was made around 698 and contained the remains of St Cuthbert. When Cuthbert's remains were reburied in 1827 in a new coffin, some 6,000 pieces of 4 previous layers of coffin were left in the burial before finally being removed in 1899. And this is where this fragment we can see on screen comes from. It was thought to come from Cuthbert's first wooden coffin, dating to around 698, after which his remains were moved into a stone sarcophagus. And the coffin itself, the original wooden coffin, is a rare example of Anglo-Saxon wood carving, inscribed with linear images, Latin lettering, and Anglo-Saxon runes, which name a number of apostles and saints. And when we look at the face, a haloed figure from St Cuthbert's coffin, we can see the similarities with the Hexham plaque, but also with the small figure marked on this Anglo-Saxon silver coin, minted around 700. This time, the line around the head being either a halo, or it has also been interpreted as a cowl being worn on the head of the face, which has 2 dots of unknown purpose on the forehead, and an inscription which appears to be talismanic, does not record any known name or place or moneyer. But what's quite striking is the similarity in terms of the construction of the facial figures, the way in which the incised lines have been used to run from the eyebrow down to the nose, and also I think brings up this idea of the use of simple, straight, wide curved lines as the easiest way for inscribing on a wooden or a stone surface. And this style is then transferred into inscribing on what is an easier surface to inscribe, where you can include greater detail, as we can see from the little crosses and the tiny little mouth on the plaque, but the style is transferred even where a greater degree of inscribing skill would be possible. So the same level of skill applied to a number of different materials that carry that style across all of these objects dating to around 700 AD. We're now going to take a short break before we carry on with the second part of our talk. And I'm going to leave here on screen part of an object made from ivory. It dates from the early 1000s. It's on display in the British Museum galleries, and I'll just tell you what size it is. If you were to look at it in the display case, it is 5 centimetres from bottom to top and has a width of 14 centimetres. And while we have our 10-minute break, have a look at what you can see carved onto this object. Have a look at any clues you can see on the object about what it might have been used for, whether you are looking at a complete object here or part of an object, and pop your ideas into the chat box and all will be revealed in 10 minutes.
Hello and welcome back. Welcome back. So somebody's guessed it's an ivory head of a bishop's crook. And you can see there's a central figure there with a cross in his hand. So that seems quite a good guess. But I'm sure, Katharine, you'll tell us exactly what it is.
Yes, well, I think that as you've pointed out, Malcolm, there are some little clues, not only in the shape, but also the decoration of this object, which help us to understand its function. It is indeed ivory. It's carved from walrus ivory, and it is referred to as a T-shaped cross. There are the two arms of the cross on either side, and then at the bottom there is a hexagonal socket. And this socket has got a large hole punched through it with a couple of smaller pinholes, one of which still contains its metal rivet. And this is a clue that this is only part of an object that we're looking at, and that originally there would have been a lower part, probably made from wood, a wooden staff, and that this cross was attached to the top of it. The whole cross is carved in high relief on all sides, and there were traces of gold sheeting which originally formed the background to the decoration, and in particular where you can see plain triangular areas, experts think that there was possibly thin gold sheeting applied to these parts of the cross decoration. At the centre is the risen Christ, who is himself holding a cross and a book. The arms of the cross are decorated with acanthus leaves and flowers. And if you look very carefully at this foliage, you will see that there are a number of small round-bodied creatures. This one looks like a very little round-bodied fat goose climbing through the foliage. And there are also griffin heads on each end at the bottom of the cross. One of them is broken off, but we can see the griffin head here on the left-hand side. And the griffin head is turned back with its beak biting on the acanthus leaves decorating above. The upper ends of the arms are carved with open-jawed heads with fangs. And behind their little rounded ears, you can see that each of these heads, they look rather like a sort of either a large lion, but their mouths are a bit fish-like, but they have a little rounded ear. And behind them, there are panels with interlaced knots. And the space below, if you look below their jaws, you'll see that there are some holes driven through the ivory, which then continue down onto the arms on both the right-hand side and also the left-hand side. And it's thought that these were holes for attaching gemstones, pearls, or perhaps for attaching gold sheeting wrapped around the outside edge of the cross. There are also 5 rivet holes surrounding the circular opening at the top, suggesting that there was also something attached to the top. And the whole piece was found in a rectory garden in Warwickshire before 1903. And as someone suggested in the chat, we are indeed looking at the top part of a crozier, a stylized staff carried by a bishop or an abbot. And if we then look at the other side of the head, we can see that on the back, we have an image of Christ crucified, which then mirrors the image of Christ risen on the other side. And stylistically, the decoration on the cross, which on the back is the same as the front. So if you look carefully, you can spot those little round-bellied creatures crawling through the acanthus leaves and the flowers. And this decoration seems closer to manuscript traditions than other ivories from the time. And I've popped down here at the bottom of the screen an opportunity for you to compare the griffin heads in particular. So the griffin heads, which would have been at the end of each arm, only one survives, are very similar to those which you see below, decorating an initial letter B in a book of Psalms made around 1025 at Bury St Edmund's Abbey. The manuscript is now held by the Vatican Museum, but you can see on this particular page, the page has been turned sideways. You can see there that would be the back of the letter B. You then have the two curves of the B with the writing underneath. But what we're looking at are these little griffin heads and also the interlaced decoration, both of which you can see reflected on this ivory. So again, we have the idea of a style of decoration being used across different surfaces, being used in written form as part of a manuscript, and then also being carved and incised into ivory. Now, one of the things that does not survive well in British buried archaeological records is organic fibres. So cloth, clothing, does not survive well. However, we do have objects which give us an insight into the production of fabrics. And we have here on screen some examples of Anglo-Saxon objects which would have been used in domestic settings for producing fabrics to then be made into clothing and furnishings. So at the top, we have a bone pin beater. It's pointed at both ends and it has a small incised band of decoration, interlaced lines, and also diamond chevron decoration in the middle. It's 11 centimetres long and dates to the 600s, so quite early in the Anglo-Saxon period. And then below it, we have two clay loom weights from Sutton Courtenay in Oxfordshire. And to the right, you can see I've included a photograph of a reconstructed loom from West Stow, modern Anglo-Saxon village in East Anglia. And this gives us an idea of how both the objects at the British Museum, recovered from the archaeological record, would originally have been used in the production of fabric. So the loom weights are used on what are known as vertical looms. And by tying the loom weights at the bottom of the warp threads, the weaver is able to create an even tension from top to bottom. Now, looms such as this would have been used mainly by women who were the main weavers, and the loom weights themselves were generally made from clay with a hole in the centre or at the top. And making loom weights from clay gave the weaver greater control over the shape, size, and weight of the loom weights, which would improve the weaving and therefore the final textile produced on the vertical loom. The two layers of thread were separated and held in place by a piece of wood, which we can see here running across the bottom of the loom. This is known as the hurdle. And most Anglo-Saxon households would have owned sheep, so had easy access to the wool needed to make the thread. Weaving and sewing clothes required skill to ensure the threads were tightly woven to avoid holes in the finished cloth. And this is where our pin beater comes in, because this is a specialist weaving tool which would have been used to compact and straighten the threads running across the loom, pushing them against the other set of threads running at right angles to give you a tight, smooth, finished surface to your weave. And this finished fabric would then be used for making clothing for the household. And we know that the Anglo-Saxon period is a period of history following on from the province of Britannia when Britain was part of the Roman Empire. And if we go back to the early 400s, this province of Britannia broadly encompassed what is now England and Wales. And when this area ceased to function as a province of the Roman Empire, the production of coins effectively came to an end and a non-monetary economy developed. And the scales that you see on screen would have been used by Anglo-Saxon traders for weighing metals, such as the Roman coins you see below them, which were made from bronze and silver. Because they were struck from pure metals, the erstwhile coins had a value as bullion, as did other scrap metals such as hack silver, small pieces of jewellery cut into small pieces to be melted down and reused. And the bronze scales, which we see at the top, would have been handheld. They have a pivoted suspension arm with two small concave pans. They date to around the 500s to 600s and were found at Dover in Kent, and would have been a way of gauging value and determining levels of exchange for buying and selling using a form of metal which was continuing to circulate in Roman Britain, which now no longer held a value based on the inscriptions and the agreed values of the earlier Roman period, but now held a value based on the material it was made from, gold, silver or bronze, and the weight of that material. Now, the first Anglo-Saxon coins produced after Roman coins stopped being minted and actively circulated as currency were produced in Kent around AD 625. And these were small gold coins modelled on coins produced by the Franks in modern France. And they were often inscribed with words borrowed from Frankish or Roman coinage. Now, around 675, these small gold coins were superseded by the silver penning or penny. And early Anglo-Saxon silver pennies were decorated with geometric or abstract designs, occasionally carrying the name of the moneyer who had produced them. And more rarely, these early Anglo-Saxon coins produced specifically in the kingdoms of Northumbria and East Anglia also bore the name of the local Anglo-Saxon monarch. Now, in the late 700s, a new style of thinner silver penny appeared, and this is what we're looking at here on the screen. It's a silver penny minted for Offa, King of Mercia. And this new type of penny was probably introduced by Offa around 760. And the increased surface area of these new pennies enabled the inclusion of more information, including, as we can see here, a lettered legend naming both the king and the moneyer who had made the coin. So we see here, we have offer's name, O-F-F-A, and also the use of the Latin word rex for king. And then on the other side, we have the name of the moneyer, Edhun, who was probably working, producing coins in London. From around 800, monarchs gained greater control over coin production, and the designs used by different moneyers became more standardized. And in the 1860s, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Mercia and Wessex formed a monetary alliance in which coins of a common design could circulate in both kingdoms. So the economy and the way of circulating wealth and facilitating trade within that economy start to become more standardized as these monetary alliances develop between different kingdoms, and coins acquire not only a bullion value, but also a face value based on their provenance and their production by known monarchs and rulers of these different Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Very much in the same way that the coins we use nowadays, although they no longer have the bullion value, they're made from alloys, not pure metals, have an agreed face value based on the face of Queen Elizabeth II, and the value given to those coins, be it 2 pence, 5 pence, 10 pence, a pound, agreed amongst the people who buy and sell with that coinage. This silver coin is a coin minted, and it is the only coin minted, known to have been minted, in the name of an Anglo-Saxon queen consort. It is the silver coin of Queen Cynrith, and she was the wife of Offa. The imagery on her coin reflects the style of portrait used on the coins of late Roman empresses, in the same way that the image we saw on Offa's coin showed him as a late Roman emperor. So the queen wears a draped dress or tunic fastened with round pins at her shoulder. She has her hair swept away from her face in stylized curls, and she wears a round diadem on her head. And the accompanying inscription on the front of the coin gives us the name of the moneyer who issued the coin, who struck the coin. And on the reverse, we have a curly M standing for Mercia. And we have words drawn again from the Latin, this time Regina, meaning queen, and letters from Synethryth's name on the other side. So Queen Synethryth of Mercia, the only Anglo-Saxon queen so far known to have had coins struck in her own name. This small object, which we see on the left-hand side of the screen, is a gold fitting. And rather like the crozier head that we saw earlier, at the bottom, we have a round socket. And this probably is the top of a pointer. The top of the fitting is made from gold. It's hollow on the back, and on the front has beaded gold wire and groups of gold granules decorating it around a central blue glass stud. And there's a gold rivet at the open end of the socket, which probably originally attached this to an ivory or wooden pointer. It dates from the late 800s and was found in Dorset. And the pointer would have been used for following words when reading a book. And we know that when King Alfred had copies of the translated pastoral care of Pope Gregory sent to bishops throughout England, he was also believed to have sent a precious pointer with each volume. And Pope Gregory was revered in Anglo-Saxon England because he had sent the Christian missionary Augustine to Kent. And as a result, Gregory's own writings were widely studied. And what we see on the other side of the screen is a manuscript, a page from a manuscript now held by the Bodleian Libraries at the University of Oxford, which is a translation into Old English of Pope Gregory's work on pastoral care, which considered good stewardship and the qualities needed for good leadership. Now, the translation we see here on screen is actually attributed to King Alfred himself and may have been the translation that was circulated to a number of bishops accompanied by a pointer. And in a letter which Alfred sent out to the bishops, he describes how the standard of Latin learning had declined so much following many decades of Viking attacks that foreign scholars rarely travelled to England. And therefore, learning had to circulate internally. Thus, he instructed his bishops to lead a programme of translating works from Latin, the language of the church, into the more widely accessible English vernacular, and to educate the young to read their own language. And it was with this in mind that Alfred probably sent out his own translation of Pope Gregory's work to bishops across England. And Anglo-Saxon manuscripts are books with the most remarkable beauty and sophistication. And those that survive indicate not only the level of scholarly interest in existing works, but also in producing copies of the Bible, in particular the Old Testament and Psalms, within the developing Christian communities of later Anglo-Saxon England. And what we have here is a manuscript from a book of Psalms made in Kent. And what it shows on the left-hand side is a page illustrated with David, King David, playing his harp, surrounded by musicians and scribes. And it is decorated with a type of manuscript decoration known as insular decoration, which literally means of the islands. And this style is believed to have originated in Ireland and Britain, from where it later spread to continental monasteries founded by Irish and British missionaries. And the earliest flourishing of manuscript culture in Anglo-Saxon England took place in Northumbria, a kingdom that stretched north from the River Humber into southern Scotland. And the text we see here is the earliest surviving example of a translation of the Psalms, first written in 384. This copy dates to around 725, with a one-page scene of the biblical King David, enclosed in an arched frame decorated with scroll work and interlacing in gold and colour. There are also 4 roundels, which you can see at the top and the bottom of the arch columns, featuring eagles at the top and dogs at the bottom. And this particular manuscript is from the Cotton Collection, one of the founding collections of the British Museum. It was produced in southern England, probably in Canterbury and contains the Book of Psalms together with a number of early Christian hymns. The main scribe for the Psalms is also the artist of the miniatures. It's written in Latin on vellum. And the manuscript is known to have been at Canterbury in 1553. 3 years later, by 1556, it was owned by Sir William Cecil, who lent it to Matthew Parker, Archbishop of Canterbury. By the end of the century, 1599, it was in the possession of Sir Robert Cotton, and it became national property along with the rest of the Cotton Library in 1702. This library was then incorporated into the British Museum when it was founded in 1753 and is now held by the British Library, who hold the manuscripts and the majority of the original British Museum Library transferred up to the new building on the Euston Road in the 1980s. And this particular volume is known as the Vespasian Psalms because it was originally stored in the British Museum Library, where the shelves were named after the set of busts of Roman emperors which stood along the top of the shelves. So this one was stored in the section of shelves topped by Vespasian himself and is thus catalogued as the Vespasian Book of Psalms. And its current binding with the metal clasp to close it were provided by Cotton when he collected the manuscript into his own private collection in the early 1700s. Well, I hope you've enjoyed our talk today about the Anglo-Saxons, and that the objects we have looked at have picked up some of the key themes that we need to bear in mind when we are thinking about Anglo-Saxon England, a long period of time where we are moving from a society, an economy, an infrastructure that arises out of a wealthy, flourishing Roman province, which takes us through many hundreds of years through to what is often referred to as the next big period of British history, the Norman conquest, the Norman period, the beginning of the Plantagenet kings, the medieval period after 1066. So if anyone has any questions they would like to ask, I'd be delighted to answer anything that people have popped into the chat or the Q&A. Thank you, Malcolm.
Thank you very much. And I have a question straight away to kick off for you. There seems something strange about replacing a brick and stone structure with one made from wood. Is this an example of different cultures clashing, or is it a case of more general purpose, lower class housing being required as opposed to villas?
That is an excellent question. And I think it also points to one of these key themes running through the Anglo-Saxon period, and also invites us to think about the change and continuity in this period in a slightly more sophisticated way than is sometimes the period's given credit for. When people come into the Anglo-Saxon galleries, if you look at the Anglo-Saxon material culture, having just come out of the Roman Britain gallery, what people often think is, oh, when Roman Britain fell and the Anglo-Saxons arrived, what we have are simpler, less sophisticated objects. Early Anglo-Saxon England is sometimes seen as more primitive than late Roman Britain, England. But I think what we have to remember is that we are looking at a period where, when the province of Rome collapsed, you had an existing infrastructure, and you could say, well, why not just carry on living in those stone villas? Why not just carry on using those Roman buildings? But of course, once Roman Britain collapsed, once it stopped being a Roman Empire, all the mechanisms supporting that infrastructure also collapsed. So if you have a sophisticated Roman town where you have a moneyed economy running through it, once that moneyed economy collapses, then you have a departure of the merchants, you have a departure of the wealthy elite who are buying goods, you have a departure of a standardized coinage that everyone can use for buying and selling. You also then, dare I say, have a collapse of the sewage works. Once a city is not run with all its infrastructure running in the way that it had been, then your reason for continuing to live in that city or that town starts to decline. So what we see is a continuation of population. We must let go of the idea that when the Anglo-Saxons arrived, there was somehow sort of a slaughter or a massacre of the existing population. There was a continuation of the population, but that population started to use their landscape in a slightly different way. So Meonstoke's a perfect example of this. You've got a very wealthy, flourishing agricultural estate, which is producing food, which can then be exported out of the province of Britannia to the rest of the Roman Empire. Once Britannia is no longer part of that Roman Empire, that farm then loses its markets. And so what happens is you start to have a more local worldview. You still want to farm that land, but your market is now more domestic. It's the people living on that land and the villages around that farm. And what you also have is you have a way of life that is being brought in with some of these early Anglo-Saxon settlers. So they're bringing their farming knowledge. A lot of the early settlers are moving in, and they're moving into areas that were farmed previously in Roman times. But what they also bring with them is their way of life. So this is where you have to be careful not to see, for example, a wooden building as being more primitive than a stone building. What you have are a group of people coming in who bring with them their woodworking skills, and they don't necessarily have the stone and brick making skills that you need to not only build, but to maintain the extant Roman buildings. So they bring with them a way of living that works for them in terms of their skills, in terms of their lived heritage, and in terms of the natural resources in the British landscape. What you then find later on is that those Roman buildings don't necessarily disappear. They may no longer be lived in, but the materials that they are built from then goes back into the built landscape. And a lovely example of this is at Balcombe Roman Villa down in Sussex, where the Roman villa, which was a wealthy, prosperous farm in late Roman Britain, stopped being used as a farm building in the early Anglo-Saxon period, but now exists 2 fields away as the village church. And in effect, when they came to build their church, what they did was they used the pre-cut stone and brickwork and terracotta from the villa and basically dismantled it, took it 2 fields across, and then used those materials to build the stone. So a lot of Roman building material was used as spoiler. It still exists, but what people did was they repurposed the structures around them. And when I say structures, I don't just mean building, I mean, you know, the economy, the markets, to suit their needs at that particular time. So I think that's what you see with these early Anglo-Saxon wooden buildings, is you're looking at use of a local material, use of an existing technology that the Anglo-Saxons bring with them. And what we also have to remember is that those Roman villas are not how everyone in Roman Britain was living. And that there was a continuity from the Iron Age of roundhouses made from timber, wattle and daub with straw roofs. So even in late Roman Britain, very few people were living in stone villas. And so this idea of working with wood is something that not only the Anglo-Saxons brought with them, but existed within the community that they found when they arrived after the fall of the Roman Empire.
Thank you, Catherine. A little question from here. So the ivory cross that you said earlier on the first face we saw, there was a man with a cross in his hand. So is the top of the staff like the one the central figure is holding? Would there have been something at the top to make it more like a cross?
Oh, that's a very good question. We don't know what the fitting at the top was. There's a clue from the holes in the top of the cross head and also the rivet holes around the edge that something was originally on top of the cross. It doesn't seem, from the shape of the surviving cross, that it would have necessarily been the top bit of the arm of the cross. It's not a case of the top bit of the arm having been broken off. We tend to think of a Christian cross being in the traditional at right angles, two separate arms. This cross is a different type of cross known as a T cross, which comes from Christian traditions in mainland Europe. And therefore the shape of this cross with the lower shaft and the cross arm and the curly ends is a specific type of cross known as a T cross. And there are examples of those from mainland Europe. So it was never intended to look like the cross that you see Christ holding. And interestingly enough, given that it's a bishop's crozier, most bishop's croziers in the British church would have been almost scroll-like because they're based on the shepherd's crook. So this is quite an unusual shape because not only is it not the usual curled shape that you have at the top of a bishop's crook, but it's not the usual shape that we expect to see when someone sees cross, because it's a different form of Christian cross known as a T cross, which is not as common. It's quite an unusual item.
Thank you, Catherine. So the next question is a first question, because it's a question for me. In response, are there any more talks? There are more talks. They will begin in May, and they will be excitingly new talks because we'll have other people than Catherine talking for the first time. So I think we're going to get the British Library is going to be involved, and there might be other partners. It's early days, but Catherine is definitely back, and she is doing the majority of the talks. And I think, I can't remember off the top of my head, I think it was it the 8th of May? I can't remember. Was it the week after?
The dates will be, I think it's the end of May into June.
Yeah, there's 6 of them, isn't there?
Yes, and my 2 particular talks, I'm going to be looking at objects from the British Museum, which talk to quite a local history. So looking at the history of London and objects that help us to understand what was happening in the area now known as Greater London back into prehistoric times, and also a little bit about the history of the museum itself in London, what happened to the building, particularly in the 20th century with the 2 world wars. I have to say it's been an absolute pleasure delivering the talks that we've had really over I think it's almost 2 years now, Malcolm, isn't it? And one of the things I'm particularly interested in is anyone who is with us today, if there's any aspects of the talk so far that you have particularly enjoyed, please pop that into the chat, because then I can share that information with future partners as well. So, you know, if you particularly like the images, if you particularly like close-ups, if you particularly like it where I've popped in a contextual photograph. So we had the photograph of the Taplow burial being excavated as well as the objects themselves. Anything that you thought really helped you to learn and broaden your understanding, pop that into the chat, because then we can share that with other people delivering the talks in the future. Also, perhaps the level of information. Do you like talks which are very closely focused on one particular subject? So, for example, we had a talk all about Canterbury and the development of the Shrine of St Thomas Becket? Do you like broader talks that perhaps like today look at a much wider period, but obviously we can't go into as much depth because we're just picking up themes across the period? Do you like talks that look at the history of objects? We've done some talks about objects at the British Museum and how they got there, so the history of collecting. So any thoughts or feedback that you have before we close the talk today, just pop it into the chat. There's no wrong or right answers, but it just all helps us to then structure the talks going forward.
I was going to say, yeah, if you, I think the talk's going to finish in a second, but you can always email me with this and I can pass it on to Katharine. So if you think of this afterwards, email me and I will pass all this on to Katharine. I've got to say, this has been the most enjoyable 6 talks that we've done. I've learned loads. I feel really lucky to host these things for you, Katharine, because you're always, I always leave a wiser person. And it's been absolutely amazing that we've had the biggest viewers that we've ever had, as it were, people. So that's amazing. So I just want to say thank you very much.
Thank you, learners. Thank you, Malcolm.
And as always, I'll leave the last word to Katharine.
Well, my last word is thank you very much indeed. It has been a pleasure joining you every Monday morning. I hope I've given you some food for thought. I hope, as well as a bit of information, I've also given you different ways perhaps of looking at objects and starting to interpret them and start to understand them, and really just revealed the nuance and the grey areas that exist within both archaeology and history. And it's those grey areas and those differing views and those different interpretations which really just keep driving interest forward and mean that we can keep coming back to the same objects, bringing new ways of looking at them, and that what we know now is not what we will know in 50 years. So let's see what we find out in 50 years' time and how thoughts have changed. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, and hopefully we'll see you all in May. Cheers.